Thanks all for sticking with us right to the end. This is the last session, and I think we want to do this in a slightly more informal way. So I'm sort of chairing, but not chairing. I want to introduce, just very briefly recap. I think you know everyone on this panel, but it is just worth sort of mentioning them again. So Jonathan, who much beyond being my boss, is also one of the world's most eminent negotiators, a veteran of 4 successful peace agreements. I don't think many people can say that. And also, there's always unsuccessful ones, but successful ones always, we should remember they exist too. Emma, very dear friend and colleague. I've known Emma since the days of Iraq, where not only is she now the director of the World Fellows Programme and the International Leadership Centre at Yale, which will launch shortly, but was for many years probably the most influential non-military person in Iraq, trying to guide the US military on a path towards hopefully stabilising the country. Richard is who I've just met here, but it's been a really fascinating experience. He is Professor of Politics at Queen's University, Belfast, Director of the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice, and one of the UK's most eminent followers of terrorism and the peace process in Northern Ireland, and with whom we hope to be doing a lot more work in the future. So the absolutely impossible task, what we thought we would try and do in this session is recap. I had thought I was going to have a brief page of recap, and now it's been scribbled over with such tiny notes as everybody has been saying such interesting things. But what we have kind of pulled out as being the main lessons, and then take them in turn to the subjects that are on everyone's mind, notably Ukraine. Is there a way that we can apply some of these lessons to Ukraine, also to Ethiopia, another conflict which has both regional and potentially global implications, slightly overshadowed by Ukraine at the moment? I think there are a couple of very good reasons for doing that. One is, I mean, obviously the founding principle of all of this work is that peace lessons are transferable. And here we are in Europe, particularly, and the US, at another pivot point. We haven't seen such a point as this since September the 11th, where there was also an opportunity to learn lessons from previous attempts to negotiate with insurgencies and ideologies. And I think it's arguable that we didn't really try and learn those lessons, but we forged ahead with a strategy that has 20 years down the line proved to have not left us in a far better place than when we started. Now we have an opportunity, as we enter a new, more difficult and dangerous geopolitical phase, potentially in the Cold War, to step back and rethink about Europe's home experience negotiating peace agreements. We've spent the last 20 years trying to help other contexts do that. Now there's an opportunity for us to look again, and it's a home and urgent concern. I had a stab at trying to synthesize what has come out of today. And this synthesizing is going to be necessarily way short of everything that was relevant and important. So forgive me in advance. But the things that really stood out as being potentially applicable, and then what I'm going to do is hand over to Jonathan, because Jonathan is, again, one of the very few people who has been working in depth, not only on Northern Ireland and Colombia, but also on Ethiopia and Ukraine, to draw some parallels. But for me, the key things that stuck out, one is something came up very early, is understand the war that you're in. You don't need to understand it like a PhD student might understand it, but what is the actual nature of the conflict that you are trying to resolve? In Northern Ireland, I don't know so much about Colombia, but in Northern Ireland, what I understand is that identity was at the core of the conflict. Sergio said at the very beginning, there's the real reason you're fighting, the good reason you're fighting, and then there's the real reason that you're fighting. And you need to understand both, because ultimately a peace process needs to address both. Identity was at the heart of the Northern Ireland conflict. It is, even though Ukraine and Ethiopia are two very different kinds of conflicts, identity is also at the heart of those two conflicts, and that might paint a way forward where talks are potentially going to happen. The second thing was on the structure of negotiations. Again, we heard prepare for negotiations like you might prepare for a war. And what does that actually look like? There are a couple of analogies that people have used. Tunnels is one and bicycles are another, and they're both good for different reasons. We can't have a tunnel on a bicycle, but the idea is, first of all, you have to have somewhere a negotiation that is strong enough to take you from point A to point B, that is not going to collapse at the first hurdle, but also one that is able to keep moving. If you don't keep people moving through talks, then they can grind to a halt, and people don't then invest, whether either the counterparts don't invest in the process. You need, therefore, a process that is structured, one that has a realistic end goal where your direction of travel is clear to you. What are you actually hoping to achieve with your negotiation? You need one that is resourced and that has a team behind it, so you're not just sort of diving in. You also need the people, everybody at the table who is a key stakeholder, whether or not you like them or whether or not you think they are legitimate. There are several conflicts right now. I mean, Syria is one, but also in Ethiopia is another example where the risk is that you try to negotiate an agreement without the parties that you don't want to legitimize, and that will inevitably fail. You need an agenda. Now, somebody, I think it was Fergal who said, or maybe Avila, in our last one, we said, you need to widen the pie. You need to make sure that you don't just get embedded in one issue. You need an agenda that is therefore not so broad that, I heard this reputful story of the FARC turning up at the early attempt to negotiate with an agenda that included sort of absolutely everything, and that had to be honed down. But if you have an agenda that the Ukrainians at the moment have been trying to negotiate an agenda that was entirely a Russian agenda that has all nothing in it for Ukraine, how is that potentially saleable to the Ukrainian people? It's not, at the end of the day. So you need an agenda that widens the issue so that you can make progress against a number of fronts. You need the sandwich in your toolkit. You're going to have an elite negotiation. There's no way of getting away from it, but you also need one that connects to those civil society actors you're going to need for implementation, or to endorse it at the end of the day, at least not fight against it. Then stepping back, there's a context of your negotiations. And by context, I mean, what is the supporting architecture? There will have to be a back channel in those negotiations. Every successful negotiation has had one. A back channel does not simply mean a line of contact with the other side. It is a very, very specific thing that enables you to prepare the road for your negotiation. And you will also, and William has a good word as well for all the sort of other helpful, potentially neutral individuals who can try and broker these channels. He calls them wizards, who can help you sort of think through where you're going and quietly reach out to the other side without the profile of on the table talks. That means also the international components. And I think Avila did mention that. There are very few negotiations that are practically just one table. Most end up being multiple tables. They may not be the tables where everybody discusses everything at every table, but the Northern Ireland process had several tables where different issues were discussed. The Colombia process had a group of friends. Those kinds of international support mechanisms are really essential so that parties aren't just negotiating on their own. Part of context is whether you are negotiating while you are fighting or not. Do you have a ceasefire or not? Different contexts have taken different approaches. Colombia talked and fought. Northern Ireland needed a ceasefire. In the case of Ukraine, if you try to go for a ceasefire now, then all you do is you create a frozen conflict that's in Russia's interest. So the question there is, how do you negotiate? Just because you're actually still fighting, even if you cannot have formal negotiations, it doesn't mean that you can't have contacts that prepare the ground for negotiations. So that's part of the context. We talked about implementation as not necessarily, as sometimes ending up being the poor relation, and it can't be the poor relation because your peace process is going to extend for years and years and years after any agreement you've made, and it can fall down just as easily after you've made the agreement as before. That you need resilience, you need structures, you need personnel, you may need different people at the table who are driving those structures than you had during the peace process itself. That in that implementation, you will need to find a way to balance what ends up being, for so many conflicts, the key thing, which is, can you have both peace and justice? What is the balance between those? And that is where so many negotiations really struggle. But if you try to approach it in too hard and defined a way, before your agreement, then you may never reach the agreement. And that is a really difficult choice that both Ukraine and Ethiopia are going to have to face themselves. We talked about slippery words, constructive ambiguity in agreements. Many agreements have constructive ambiguity so that they can get to an agreement. The trick, and this is going to be another difficult one for both Ethiopia and Ukraine, is what is too much ambiguity to the point that it stops being constructive and starts being destructive ambiguity after peace agreements are signed. What else? So there were three other things that I thought were really fascinating, and I'll be really, really quick on them. One was this question of diaspora. we heard diaspora beforehand. We heard how the Irish diaspora was sort of fundamental to kind of putting the fuel in the fire, if you like, for the Good Friday Agreement. Now, diaspora was also equally critical on Ethiopia and on Ukraine as well. Not so much the Ukrainian diaspora, but the Russian diaspora for sure are playing key and interesting roles. And I don't know whether anybody's ever given a systematic and structured thought into how can we engage these diasporas in a productive way as part of either negotiations or preparations for negotiations. And somebody made a point about if social media had been around during the GFA, we would never have made the agreement. Well, it is around. And are our negotiation thinkers really up to the challenges, the new challenges of negotiations in the digital age? I mean, I still know that I don't really fully understand it. And the Ukrainian negotiators are very creative, but still, I mean, this is now a factor. I mean, social media is almost a stakeholder now in conflicts. And how do we deal with that? And we come back to this thing finally, and it's an old one, but a goodie, about leadership. Whether you can have the best negotiation strategy on earth, but if you have a poor leadership strategy, Afghanistan is an example, can it compensate? And how do you prepare and equip leaders to listen and find the advice tailored for them? Those were the main things that at least I took away. I know that it's not comprehensive by any means, but I'm now going to hand over to Jonathan to reflect on their application to these other conflicts.
Thank you very much, Claire. I think that was a very good summary. What I thought was a fascinating discussion. Why it was so valuable, I think, was because it brought together practitioners, experts, and academics. So it wasn't just one group of those people. It brought together two different conflicts. So it wasn't just getting lost in the weeds of a particular conflict like Northern Ireland or Colombia, but the points where they met together, and then dividing up the discussion into the lessons on negotiations themselves, the lessons on implementation, and the lessons on the thorny issue of peace and justice. I think those are all things that are necessary. The question, I think, is how we distill those lessons into something that can be useful to people in future negotiations. I mean, it's very interesting for us to mull over these problems, but the really practical implementation of them would be to try and find a way that can share them. As a practitioner, someone who spends his day and nights doing these things, all the conflicts are different, as we said before. And so you can't just take a cookie cutter approach and turn up and say, here we are, here's something that worked in Northern Ireland that's going to work there. What we find when we go and ask people to give us stuff that can be useful, and even just in the last few weeks, I've been asked by leaders around the world for, give me an example of a national dialogue program that works that I can apply. Give me an example of a DDR program, a truth and reconciliation program. And what we tend to get when we ask universities is either very long academic papers, several hundred pages, we were sent by a Scottish university, which is not terribly useful, or quantitative stuff. The Croc stuff on institutes on quantitative stuff is good, but it's not any use for what we're trying to do, which is actually to take the lessons and share them. So what we need is something that we could give to political leaders. Now, just to give a few examples from the point of view, if you were Zelensky, or if you are Prime Minister Abiy in Ethiopia, or frankly, even if you are the next president of Colombia and dealing with the ELN, what are the lessons that would be useful for you? And I was thinking when Avila was speaking about the Good Friday Agreement, if we'd had time to think of some of these issues in the maelstrom of trying to agree things in 3 days and 3 nights, think them through, we might have been in a better place. I was asked last week by a journalist, why did we not have more detail about the border poll and how it's going to work in the Good Friday Agreement? And the answer is because we didn't think of it at the time. But if you have someone who can help you in the negotiation, you can say, have you thought about that? Have you thought about the consequences later? At least you could think about it and then dismiss it because it's too hard politically, or not dismiss it. So just to give a flavor of the sort of things that would be useful for those 3 presidents I've mentioned, so Ukraine and Ethiopia and even the ELN, I think the obvious ones that Sergio mentioned, like the back channel, which is obviously has application to Ukraine. You're not going to make this work unless there's a back channel, both between Ukraine and Putin, and between the United States and Putin. There just will not be public negotiations that will resolve this. There's the thorny question of, do you start with the hard issues or do you start with the easy issues, which every time you start on a negotiation, people agonize about. They say as Avila was saying, you go for the low-hanging fruit, or do you go for the sensitive issues? It can work both ways, but too often people tend to start with easy issues and get stuck on those. Certainly that's the history of many negotiations. You go into confidence building measures, you go into humanitarian pauses and get stuck there and can never get on to the hard issue. So sometimes it's better to go straight into the hard issue. And if you are, for example, dealing with Ukraine, instead of just talking about a cessation, maybe what you want to talk about is territory and the right of Ukraine to have independent sovereignty. There's the issue of guarantees that we touched upon. In the case of Colombia, it was delivered by the UN Security Council. The agreement was endorsed by that, implemented at least in part by that. Good Friday Agreement too is registered with the UN and is guaranteed by the UN from that point of view. But you also have the security guarantees. If you're the president of Colombia, if you're the president of Ukraine, you want to have some lessons on guarantees. How can these guarantees actually work for me? What kind of security guarantees can I have if I'm not going to be in NATO that are realistic, that unlike the ones agreed in Budapest, are actually going to be implementable? So having some lessons somewhere that people have distilled and can put on the table would be enormously helpful. International involvement. You know, in Colombia, you had the US involved at a later stage in the negotiations. You, of course, had Venezuela involved. We had, as we heard from Niall, the US involved in the Northern Ireland negotiations. In the Ukraine, you're going to have a three-way negotiation. It's going to have to be US, it's going to have to be the West, it's going to have to be Ukraine and Russia. How does that triangle, a bit like the triangle in Venezuela, where there's a negotiation going on between the US and Venezuelan government, but also between the Venezuelan opposition and the government, and there needs to be a negotiation between the Venezuelan opposition and the US on sanctions and when they should be lifted. People need to think about these things before they start on negotiations. What happens too often is, if no one would go into a political campaign without a plan and a strategy, no one would go into a military camp, well, possibly Putin, without a military campaign, without a strategy of some sort. But people turn up at negotiations and just think they're going to succeed. People need to think through, what kind of structure of negotiation am I going to have here? What can I learn from Colombia? What can I learn from negotiations elsewhere? There's the whole issue of victims and truth and reconciliation we discussed earlier, where I thought the ideas that Eduardo put forward I think are very interesting. I think they're very difficult for the Ukrainians to think how you could go from the soft to the hard, and how you could get the Russians to accept that. And let me just make one last point, because there are lots of course I could go through, which is the zero-sum game nature of a negotiation. I personally, but also Tony Blair's government, was quite often attacked for why did we bother to make peace with the IRA. People in the right in Britain would say the IRA were defeated, we should just have accepted their defeat, we shouldn't have negotiated. The whole point is, if you want to have an agreement that lasts, you actually want an agreement which isn't a zero-sum game, where there aren't winners and losers. Both sides need to have an acceptable narrative for their own supporters to explain the sacrifices they've made, if it is going to have any chance of lasting. So that's what we did in Northern Ireland. The IRA would not have been defeated by military means alone, but we could get to a negotiated peace. The FARC would not have been completely wiped out by military means, even though they were on the back foot. You need to escape this idea of a zero-sum game, and that will apply very much to Ukraine and Russia. We may not want to save Putin's face, but if Russia feels aggrieved coming out of this by any agreement, feels it is a victim of it, then this agreement will not last. And likewise, the Ukraine, if they feel it's imposed on them, then it will not be a lasting agreement. So there are a whole series of, I mean, I could go on and on, I won't, I promise. But how do we actually capture these lessons in a way that can be shared and used? Not hundreds of pages of academic papers, not quantitative, but sort of practical lessons in a way that could be accessed, could be shared, and how can we actually capture some of the skills involved too, some of the more technical skills, and find a way of sharing them with leaders as they face these negotiations in Ukraine, in Ethiopia, in Colombia after the election, and a whole series of other places. That's, I think, a really interesting question. I don't have the answer, but maybe you guys do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You also have inside seat the world response, the US response to the war on terror, and some of the judgment. I'd be fascinated in your views. First of all, do you think that we are ready for this new geopolitical context in which we're going to attack the Europe and West, start rethinking our own negotiations, and what we can do to better it? Here you go.
Thank you for that question or questions, Claire. I think if you look back to 9/11, there was that moment of absolute moral clarity, the similar moral clarity that we see today. And when you look now, it's 20 years when you look back, and you think for 20 years, America didn't really have a sense of how this should end. What was the outcome that the US was trying to achieve? And it became 20 years of fighting without winning. 20 years that led to the death of, it's in the ballpark of 1 million Muslims. It cost $8 trillion. And there is the greatest military in the world, the greatest military that the world has ever seen, winning every battle and losing a war, losing 2 wars. And it undermined this rules-based international order, that framework that we've lived within. It undermined democracy, democracy promotion. It undermined US reputation. And in the Middle East, it changed the balance of power in Iran's favor that led to all these proxy wars across the region. It led to the creation of ISIS. It led to the outflow of refugees. And it was framed all the time with, good and evil, going after the bad guys. But as Sun Tzu said, tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And you might say, well, that's irrelevant, but I don't think it is irrelevant because it says something about how America sees itself, how it is able to pursue such an approach for so long without changing it, that there is no accountability. There's nothing, there's no resource constraints that would stop other nations. There's no repercussions for breaking international law. You're not taking Americans to The Hague. And there's no public outcry in the US about so many Arabs, Muslims being killed. So when people say, America must do something, it's always that question, what has been learned from the last 20 years that would make you feel confident that the future is going to be different? Now, since the last 2 or 3 years, America no longer frames its national security in terms of the global war on terror. It's now framed as great power competition, with the big issue being China. And then the invasion of Ukraine comes along, and it's kind of, gosh, Russia's this sort of distraction. And, last week I went to Ukraine. It was my first visit, and you have to fly into Poland and then you go overland into Ukraine. And coming out are the refugees. But going in are weapons, lots of weapons, weapons supplied by NATO countries, and lots of former military. So you can see former US Special Forces, former US military going in. They're joining the International Legion. They're joining the Mozart group, set up as the counter to Russia's use of the Wagner group. And so already you see how complex things are becoming, because now we're getting into a proxy war. These weapons being sent in, before you would think, oh, Russia. Now the use of these kamikaze drones, the switchblades, it's a new type of weapon. It changes the equation on the battlefield. You see how obsessed people now are with the tactics on the battlefield. And there's talk that Russia must lose. People sort of get a bit carried away and Putin must go. But people are not talking about, a negotiation, an end. We've got the information wars which are going on. We can't hear much of the Russian viewpoint. We hear a very strong Ukrainian messaging that comes to us without much critique of that. And it becomes harder to get a negotiation and to end the war when you've now got the West really wanting to drag Putin down inside. So it becomes harder for Zelensky to be able to make any compromise. We're not hearing of a golden bridge, people talking about how do the golden bridge for Putin to help him walk back off the cliff. We're also not hearing about how we put a wedge between Russia and China in terms of grand strategy. We think that's what America should be trying to do. So these all give me some causes to concern. What does Russia want? And if Russia is trying to negotiate a new European security architecture, and we just don't frame it in that way, we think it's all about making sure that Russia loses. But is it possible that Russia might lose every battle and yet gain strategically? Will it get its land bridge to Crimea? It's bringing extra forces in through the Wagner group. It's bringing Syrians in. You're getting more international fighters coming in. So I think we have very different doctrine. So for the West, they believe that what we're doing is below the threshold of war. But economic sanctions, all this equipment going in, or Western fighters going in, even if they're not going into a government flag. I think from the way that Russia sees this, this is not below the threshold. Russia saw democracy promotion as an act. And so I worry that we're not talking the same language, and we are not focused on trying to end this conflict. We're not thinking so much of the Ukrainian problem, how to ensure Putin is defeated in Russia.
Okay, now we've got the big guns out here. Thanks, that's a fascinating but also deeply troubling perspective that once again sort of rhetoric is becoming foreign policy rather than foreign policy modulating rhetoric. So Richard, you have been following and documenting as one of those an eminent academic and historian the Northern Ireland peace process now for many, many years. The George Mitchell Centre was established specifically to help learn the lessons from that peace process and help sort of promote those core values and ideas, both in terms of implementation, but in Northern Ireland, also more broadly. How do things now look in Europe after this long period of peace and celebrating Europe's peace? How does it look to you? And what do you think that we could do differently to better learn those lessons that you have spent so long documenting to help us now with this new, more dangerous era that we're in?
Thank you, Claire. And I've been speculating on which security service has been killing the microphones. And I initially was going with the CIA and the FBI, and then I thought it's probably Putin. Then I thought possibly the Chinese. Actually, I'm going with the Chinese. So thank you. I think there's about 3.5 minutes. So what I'll try and do is answer crisply and give what Samuel Beckett might have called an expurgated, accelerated, improved and reduced version of what I would have said if I had slightly longer. So I'll come up with 3 points. I'm going to say that before I know what they are, but I know that a good preacher should have 3. So here's the first one. So I think any academic's got to start from a point of view of sheer humility. Jonathan is absolutely right. There's absolutely no point in saying, here's my 500-page book. I remember giving a lecture some years ago, not long after the War on Terror began, and there were some practitioners in the room, and a general kindly said, can I sit next to the professor at dinner? And he sat down, and I thought, great, he's going to listen. He said, Professor, I'm never going to read one of your books. And I thought, fair enough, but which is a perfectly good, which puts him in common with almost all of humanity. But what he then went on to say was, like, this is absolutely no use. What we need is a series of things which allow you to respond agilely to the contingencies of accelerating history when they happen. There's no point saying here's 1,200 footnotes, right? All you need is something. So I think there are ways in which actually conversations like today can make a significant difference in terms of relationships. Emma mentioned earlier on today, relationships do matter. That's true in terms of negotiation. It's also true in terms of the resources that you have when you get people to listen, to engage, to build trust, to connect between as well as at events like this. So I think one thing that universities can do, Yale in an exemplary way, I hope the Mitchell Institute at Queen's University Belfast can do this too. There are ways in which you can get those relationships developed so that you've got a resource, because really the time to do what the most that you can do to solve crises is between them. The time to address crises is before they blow up suddenly in your face, and to look at building relationships, resources and connections. So I think there are ways in which that can be done. And in the Mitchell Institute at Queen's, I mean, we do look at peace, security and justice as being interwoven. It's not a choice between them. And sometimes politicians will say it's security that matters. And sometimes people will say it's justice that matters. Sometimes people say you need all three of them if you're going to make them work. So I think relationships and integration is crucial. The second thing is, I mean, how does it look now? I mean, you went through a brilliant summary, Claire, of the things that we've heard today. But as I was scribbling down and then thinking about Ukraine, it's not propitious looking, is it? I mean, the international dimensions don't look great. Peace and justice at the same time in Ukraine. Relationships clearly disastrous. Long-termism. I mean, one of the things about the Northern Ireland conflict that is very interesting, this was mentioned a number of times today, was long-termism. It is interesting that so many of the key players in the 1990s and beyond had been around for such a long time. You know, Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness, David Trimble, John Hume, Ian Paisley. No, so there was a very long-term transition of those people from the people of the 1970s to the people of the 1990s and beyond. And I think similarly, we're looking at very long-term developments, and that is in some ways the depressing thing. In other words, I don't think there are going to be any kinds of quick fix here. What you can see as a historian is you're laying the ground for generations of deep, deep grievance and enmity. What you're seeing is you're laying the ground for all sorts of polarizations. We do know that violence does that. So I think, how does it look at the moment? Very, very grim in some respects. But I'm going to try and, okay, so the third point I'm going to come up with is one which is slightly more positive, which is that although people don't listen for the most part to what academics say, and probably rightly, it is true that we know that we know some stuff which would be useful for people to listen to at crucial moments. So actually, at the time that Emma did fantastic work in trying to develop ways of thinking about not just the Iraq aspect of the post 9/11 politics, but other aspects of it too. While Northern Ireland and the Al-Qaeda atrocities were very different in some ways, there are family resemblances between how best to respond to them, and we knew all of them. So we knew not to pretend you're going to get rid of terrorism. The key thing to do is to turn the flame down so low that it becomes comparatively trivial in a life-saving way. We knew not to identify the wrong root causes, but to go for the right root causes. Actually, in Northern Ireland, there was a long time of misdiagnosing the problem and sending the solutions to the wrong address. You need to get those right. You need not to exaggerate what you can do in dealing with things militarily in counterterrorism. You need not to transgress those laws which distinguish you as liberal democracies from other states. You need to use intelligence properly and honestly, not in ways that degrade you. You need to have coordination between and within states, and you need to talk credibly in public. 7 big points. I've just come off, right? There's 3 points. I've got 7 straight out. We knew all of those in 2001, and they were all significantly ignored in ways that cost lives and limbs, as Emma has eloquently pointed out, in the post 9/11 period, okay, by the UK government as well as by the US government. So what I would say is, what can we do? We can do relationships, we can do debate, we can do listening. I've made no contribution to peace anywhere in the world at all, but people in this room have. And it's really humbling and inspiring to listen to the things that have eloquently and articulately been said today. We can build those relationships so that we can develop them. How does it look in terms of Ukraine and Russia? Grim. I suppose my optimistic spin on that is there are lots of other more grim things that we don't talk about. I mean, I think the UN figures 25,000 people die every day of avoidable hunger, for example. So I mean, there are things which we're focusing on Ukraine, but there's plenty of other depressing stuff out there as well. Okay, so we shouldn't get overly paralyzed by it. Okay, it's a grim species that needs external redemption rather than being able to do it ourselves. So we've got to do what we can. But the third thing is, I think we do need to look at what we know and be honest about it. And then sometimes it can be utilized, sometimes it can't. And I think we do rely on leadership. You talked about listening leadership. I mean, my goodness, we're short of that at the moment. I've had so many criticisms today uttered by people about the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I almost feel sorry for the bloke. I almost feel sorry. But I mean, there is a problem with leadership in the United Kingdom at the moment, there's no question. For many of us, the fact that the president of the United States is who he is rather than the other bloke is a good thing. On the other hand, other than that, it doesn't seem like it's going fantastically well, if I can be slightly discourteous. And clearly by the time you get to Putin, you're in serious difficulty in terms of listening leadership, okay? So I think there are issues in terms of those things. Having said that, I do think that what we have to do is to try and gather together the sorts of things which have been wisely said by people here today and have them as, not as neat mechanisms you can apply, but rather as deep intuitions which can inform what you do. And I think that in dealing with these conflicts, in trying to bring some sort of resolution to them, in trying to deal with appalling political violence, if you have a week where you don't make things significantly worse, that's possibly a good week a lot of the time. And I think what we've got to try and do is avoid the most egregious errors. And I think we have heard today, Claire summarized them very, very well. We've heard a lot of things today which would inform a serious-minded way of thinking about long-term relationships, about peace, security, and justice being tied together rather than separate options, about the ways in which you need to think about the things that don't get mentioned in the negotiation but are going to be necessary to your implementation, and about the various things that people have said about Colombia, very movingly and very powerfully in terms of the achievements there, about Northern Ireland, which, as Jonathan has often said, despite the problems with the Northern Ireland peace process, looked at from most conflict settings, it looks amazing. And we mustn't forget that. So we have positive things. I've probably squeezed more than 3 points in there, but I hope that those are in some way distillations of what we might be able to do, as well as some of the challenges with it.
They were 3 packed great points. So you definitely get a free pass on that. We're going to, I actually don't know how much time we've got, but I think we should throw it open to the floor. Do we have any time, Bonnie, at all to do that? But I also wanted to put a question to you. You don't have to answer it, but it's a question that's very much on my mind, which is how can we use, as relationships between states become a lot more pressured and fractured, the convening power of institutions such as this? Thank you, got 50 minutes. Because, I mean, the US, for example, is diaspora central. This is the place where everybody came. There are ways to use this kind of institution in the process of building relationships and coming up with ideas. I don't know whether we've fully explored. So that is the question to you for ideas. Any other questions? Also very welcome.
Now, with regard to Ukraine, I want to make the following point. So, question naturally is asked. I asked it myself at the beginning of the day. What should we be thinking about? What can we do? But I want to suggest we also look at the other side of that coin, which is what should we not do? And given that it's an impossible situation that nobody can actually pretend to foresee the outcome, you can see very worrying trends, as you've described all, then perhaps you should put on the table a do no harm principle in terms of closing the door to negotiations. So you don't have to go for negotiations, but at least you should not spoil them ahead of time. And that means, number one, exercising a good deal of communications discipline, which is not evident. So if you see the most recent language out of the US government, I think it's well above Emma's threshold. If you publicly say you're out there to degrade the Russians, what are they going to hear? And secondly, there is always the fascinating question of false negotiations, such as what happened in Istanbul. Is it a good thing to have false negotiations or not? Sometimes it may have a role. The Israelis write academic papers about false negotiations. But in this case, I'm not sure it's a good idea. I'm not sure it's a good idea to create false expectations to rather than having a more structured approach where you have different kinds of contacts and you don't actually pretend. Because both sides agree that it's complete theater. That both sides know exactly what they're doing in Istanbul. So anyway, just this idea of kind of do no harm, try not close too many doors.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to go back to a point that you brought up just now, and also we've been hearing today about social media. Social media has rightly been considered this platform that connects people, builds bridges, and shares information and footage on the ground on the battlefield. But I'm wondering if you could offer some advice to mediators and practitioners these days on how you basically counter disinformation, how you counter polarization that we're seeing coming out of social media platforms these days and in conflicts today. Thank you.
There's another question.
Yes, thanks so much for all your thoughts today. The question I think we should ask ourselves for Ukraine is whether or not the conditions for peace talks are ripe at this point, whether or not they are ripe. And therefore, question becomes what should be done or what shouldn't be done to get the world to a ripe point for peace negotiation. One of, I mean, we can explore this until, the cows come home, but, we can brainstorm and we can develop various scenarios for where that question leads us. The way I personally see it today is that conditions are definitely not ripe for peace talks. And that for peace to happen, war needs to be painful enough for not just one party, but both parties. And I don't see it being painful enough for Putin. I'm not saying Russia, I'm saying Putin and his people. So the question, how do we get to make it a ripe condition?
Just first of all, I actually agree with that last. Sorry, I agree with that last statement. I mean, Jonathan talked earlier about how, in a way, the outcome of the Northern Ireland talks could have been sketched out years previously, but certain things had to happen and conditions had to be right. And I don't think at the moment with Ukraine, I mean, first of all, this is a large-scale war. It's different from resolving an internal conflict. I would have thought, in many ways, that some of the basic principles of negotiation remain the same. But I would have thought that, it's extremely difficult. I think those of us outside have to be very careful, because any assuming that Russia does not spectacularly lose the war, any outcome is going to leave Ukraine worse off than it was on the 23rd of February, objectively. And how does one, but what it seems to me premature to be thinking in those ways or talking in those ways, I think is counterproductive. But that's but it's a question then of not doing any damage, really, more than anything else. Second point, on this question of usefulness and the to apply lessons, hugely difficult. And I think, I mean, in the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin, we in 2014, I think it was, launched a policy planning unit. Has it worked? I don't think so, because every efforts were made by its first director, a great colleague who died recently, to engage with academia, both in Ireland and across the world. But I don't know that what he learned or what we heard really filtered down, and that's partly because practitioners are just so bloody busy all the time. But having said that, I think there's no substitute, frankly, for perhaps academics being a bit more active in peddling their wares, in coming to foreign ministries, in coming to others and saying, look, this is what we've done, this is what you're doing. And that can be useful, I think, But I find, I'm involved in some work in Northern Ireland at the moment, and I keep having to say to my academic colleagues on the particular committee I serve on, look, this is all very well, but have you met are we meeting the parties? Are we out there? So I think, codify, simplify, absolutely. But as I say, keep knocking on doors, keep bringing people up, keep saying we're here and we know things and they could be useful to you. Probably don't expect traffic to come in the other direction because of the sheer pressures upon practitioners.
We have people online can't hear us. So we have 4 questions, and I'm going to go probably starting with Jonathan and going around. The 4 questions basically are: what would be an do no harm principle structure for Ukraine? How can we get Ukraine and Russia to a place where it was possible to make peace? What would be the conditions that would make that possible? How do we deal with social media, and what more could we do? And how can we better peddle our wares to policymakers?
I'm going to group Sergio's question with the question about the ripeness of Ukraine, because I think they relate to each other. It is true that, as I believe it to be true, that there isn't what the academics call a perceived mutually hurting stalemate in Ukraine. And there certainly isn't enough pain for Putin to negotiate seriously. And so I think he's simply going through the motions to show the Chinese and others that he is negotiating without any intention of really negotiating. And if you look back historically, unless you have a mutually hurting stalemate, it's very unusual to get to an agreement. But equally, I'm always a little bit skeptical about the academic idea of ripeness, because it's not like a peace agreement is like a pear. You can reach up on a tree and feel if it's ripe or not. You only ever know ex post facto whether it was right, which then takes me to my answer to Sergio's question, which is, it is true that forced negotiations can give people illusions of action, whereas in fact there is no action. But I think on the whole, that's better than missing an opportunity. So Palestinians often complain, say it's terrible to have all this process. We don't want any more process. It's all just a way of managing us. Let's have no negotiations. And my question to them would be then, how do you think you're ever going to solve the problem? If you don't negotiate and you can't win militarily, what is your solution to the problem? Just waiting around and complaining. So I think there is a danger with false negotiations. I think it's important to be clear that your expectations are low of the negotiations, but I think it's better to try in the hope that you may have got to the mutually hurting stalemate sooner than you thought, because otherwise we could be waiting a very long time in Ukraine before you get to negotiations, and there could be not much left of Ukraine by that point. In terms of social media, I kind of feel more generally about social media that social media didn't create the problems, it simply amplifies them. It just makes it all faster and bigger and noisier and more unpleasant. So when we negotiated the Good Friday Agreement, there was no social media, but there was plenty of media, thousands of them camped outside. And every time a rumor went through their ranks that something was happening, it would get out of control. So managing just the media was hard enough. Social media, as I say, just takes it to another level. But I think the way of managing it is probably the same as with the media, which is firstly, confidentiality. Negotiations don't really work if you conduct them in public, despite people's requests for transparency. If you contrast Kagwan negotiations in Colombia with the Sergio's successful negotiations, Kagwan was ridiculous. It was carried out live on television. The FARC turned up in their uniforms with their guns and machetes. They insisted the whole thing be recorded. It was never a serious negotiation. It had a 100-point agenda with the end of capitalism as one of the items, which was unlikely to be agreed by the Colombian government. Whereas Sergio's negotiations were entirely confidential in Havana for 6 months and only became public the day before they were announced by a leak. So confidentiality is crucial to managing that, but confidentiality has to be combined with carrying your base with you. We talked earlier about David Trimble's mistakes. David Trimble's mistake was he never carried his base with him. Negotiating with the UEP was like negotiating with a focus group. Each person had a different view, and you couldn't ever get them to agree on anything themselves, let alone more generally. So where Sinn Féin were excellent at it, and actually the DUP were excellent at managing their people. So what you need are people who can negotiate confidentially in terms of negotiations, but then have a very clear narrative that Sergio was talking about earlier to carry their base with them and explain what they're doing. And that will work for social media as well as it will for media. I don't think there's a magic, my own view is there's no magic cure for social media any more than there is generally. And I'm not convinced that what's his name, Elon Musk buying Twitter is going to solve it either. Lastly, in terms of selling our wares, I think what I find anyway is that if you've got a story to tell, you can usually find your way through with this. The trouble is if you approach organizations at a low level, they are frightfully busy, and they also know they're not decision makers. If you can make a breakthrough high up the chain of command in either an armed group or a government, then you can get them to listen. Doesn't mean they'll do the right thing, usually not, but at least listen to what you're suggesting. And if you've got a story of a successful negotiation, and at the moment there aren't many of those around apart from Colombia and Northern Ireland, so it is possible to get a hearing. And I think it is worth doing that, because I do think there is a story to tell about both those negotiations. And as we've discussed today, there are lessons that people should at least think about, even if they don't necessarily apply them.
Thanks, Jonathan. Just to very quickly add to this point about social media, that what it has done is it's created higher costs for bad communications and communication gaps. So I think there is something to be done about dealing with the people who actually own some of these platforms to make sure that they are scanning them for fake news videos and other things. But fundamentally, a negotiation delegation that shall remain nameless, we were told that they would sort of go into talks and come out, and then a couple of members of the delegation would go off and just tweet their particular perspective about what happened in the talks. It was really catastrophic. So part of this, again, is about message discipline, having something to say, and making sure that you do continue to communicate it and don't leave those communication gaps out there.
Thank you, Claire. Very briefly on 2 of the 4 excellent points that were raised. On the ripeness, the way I would characterize it, and this has come up in the discussions today quite frequently, for negotiations to work in the circumstances we're describing, you do need enough key people to be convinced of the inefficacy of force. One of the main central things in the Northern Ireland peace process was that organizations in the 1970s who thought that force was going to be the best way of achieving what they wanted, by the 1990s had decided that it wasn't. As Jonathan said, they couldn't be eradicated, but they had been persuaded of the inefficacy of force and therefore were open to other ways of dealing with things. How to create that is very difficult and probably long-term, but it's a crucial aspect to what we've been discussing. I think it's the ineffectiveness of military means, I suppose. On the policymakers and academics, I think it's absolutely right. And I think that, I suppose my only thing, Rory, would be to say that as far as possible, academics should be open to being in frequent and ongoing relationships with policymakers, which allow for the possibility, when the moment is right, for some kind of advice, some kind of counsel, some kind of input, that it's not then something where you have to go up a hill very steeply to build the relationships because they're already there. So that is something where I think it's about trying to cultivate the sort of networks which mean that on those occasional moments when an academic is useful, people know who they are and why they're useful and have the sense of their credibility and their cogency. And so occasionally that can make, I think, a difference. But it probably does come back actually to the point which Sergio made, which I do agree with. As I say, I think avoidance of egregious mistakes is probably the main thing to focus on. I think if you can avoid doing harm, then that probably is good. Sometimes there are things academics might occasionally have a footnote on that.
If you'd asked me 20 years ago, how would the global war on terror end, I would never have guessed that America would hand Afghanistan back to the Taliban, or that Iran would be, the big winner of the Iraq war. And so I think it's really important that we don't lack imagination, and we can help paint portraits, scenarios of what the future might look like. Whose side is time on? That's really not clear. We're already seeing protests in the West at the rise of the cost of living. It could well be that Biden and others are gone long before Putin goes. If Putin is pushed and pushed and pushed, he might use nukes, he might use chemical weapons. If we don't have debate, if we close down all debate in the West, and if it just becomes as good and evil, we're then using again what we did 20 years ago. You can look at how John Mearsheimer is being treated at the moment. A realist who came out and said many years ago that NATO shouldn't expand right up against Russia's borders. It would make Russia feel threatened. Henry Kissinger said the same. John Gaddis here said the same. It's important that we have debate. I think the big country that is yet to play in this is China. And China has potential to be a mediator. Will it take that role? We don't know. But this could be China's moment, how to engage with China on this issue. how to think of new international architecture fit for the 21st century. There's no going back to Pax Americana. What can be built from this, hopefully before we have massive destruction and World War III?
Thanks. Maybe controversially, I wonder whether we shouldn't challenge the idea of a mutually hurting stalemate in the case of Russia and Ukraine. I mean, the fundamental premise is that both sides suffer enough pain and get to the point where they just realize they can't achieve their goals by military means and agree to come to the negotiating table, when it just becomes too difficult to continue to pursue it. But I mean, there's a big difference between a population suffering and a leader suffering. I think that's one key thing. And also there's a hugely different degree of tolerance to long pain in different countries. We in the West are simply not used to it. We have been spoiled by the 80s and 90s, and we're not really even yet, suffering a lot. We may have more pain to come, but our tolerance is far lower than countries like Russia, who suffered so dreadfully, beyond dreadfully in World War II, and do sort of look back at that as the most glorious moment still. So we don't know whether a mutually hurting stalemate is going to make conditions ripe. The negotiations also are, as our colleague William Ury loves to say, part psychology as much as anything else. And sometimes it's not enough to tell somebody or to hope that somebody eventually comes to see that their army is just not strong enough. They can just keep throwing things at it over years and years and years. But to find a way to convince them of a narrative that shows them not as a loser forced to come to the table, but as a victor by other means. And that's something that we're not setting ourselves very well up to do in the case of this particular conflict, which goes back to Sergio's point about do no harm. Like, how do we create space for that narrative to emerge when what we're going around saying at the moment is the good versus evil? We have to make sure that somehow Putin falls from power, and that is the objective. So it's something to bear in mind. I think we may well be out of time. I just want to say a huge thank you to Bonnie and Hera and to Emma for organizing this. And to Richard, whose idea it was in the first place, pretty much. And to all of you for sitting with us through all of this, and to all of the incredible panelists who have spoken. It's been a pleasure.